Good morning, and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in this morning, and as always, my pleasure to be here. We'll continue now our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. We, having yesterday at the end of the broadcast concluded chapter 16 of the book, we'll now continue with chapter 17, and in this chapter we'll be discussing the coercive power of the Roman Catholic Church, parties and factions within that church, the quarrel between Rome and Avignon, Philip of France and Boniface VIII, the power claimed by his bull Unum Sanctum, the promise of Clement V to condemn Boniface VIII, John the 22nd and Nicholas V, Benedict XII, the corruption of the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th century, three councils called by Gregory XII, Benedict XIII, and cardinals, Council of Pisa, it condemns both popes and deposes them, Alexander V elected, he confirms all the decrees of the council, three popes, Baltasar Costa becomes pope as John the 23rd. The Council of Constance tries and condemns Gregory XII, Benedict XIII, and John the 23rd. The latter found guilty of enormous and scandalous crimes. He is deposed and the doctrine of the Pope's infallibility condemned. Difficulty in maintaining the succession of the popes. May be two infallible popes at the same time, corruption in the council, John Huss and Jerome, their trial and death, the effect in Bohemia, Martin V, his policy, the violation of his promise to Alfonso, his bull against the King of Aragon, his letter to his legate, becomes sole pope, his letter to the King of Poland for exterminating the Hussites, his death, and the effects of his reign. It's a very busy subject as our chapter, as are most chapters in this book, but this one in particular is going to demonstrate the abject folly that is the papacy. It is going to, through accurate recording of history, prove there could be no such thing as papal infallibility, and that the Roman Catholic Church, when it calls itself Christian, is a demonstration of the most absurd insinuation. Now, my apologies to those who are sympathetic to the Roman Catholic Church, and I only hope that you will listen with an objective ear and judge for yourself based on the historically preserved facts. Now, the author begins by saying the interference of the popes with the domestic civil affairs of nations was undoubtedly superinduced by their possession of temporal power in Rome. The fact of having acquired this power by means so totally different from any employed by the apostles or by the Christians of the first centuries naturally tended to destroy their Christian humility and to implant in their minds ideas of personal and official grandeur. Under such influences, many of the popes became politicians and were mixed up for several centuries in controversies with kings and princes. They neglected the spiritual affairs of the church and seemed to think that God was sufficiently served by an enlargement of their own temporal authority. The number of bulls, briefs, and encyclicals issued by them concerning temporal matters greatly exceeded those involving the interests of religion. Having in this way separated themselves from the influence of the apostolic example, and finding the world, on account of its ignorance, in a condition to acquiesce in imposture, they did not hesitate to set up the claim of divine power, sufficiently broad and comprehensive to embrace within it the right to govern the kings and the princes, and through them, the people. When they succeeded in obtaining a practical recognition of this power as pertaining to the organization of the church, they found it necessary to go one step farther in order to preserve it. This was the introduction of the doctrine as part of their religious system that this immense power was to be maintained, if necessary, by force. Hence the persecution and extirpation of heretics, and also the doctrines now avowed by Pope Pius IX in his Syllabus of Error. Although by these means they were enabled to secure several centuries of success during which the world was held in complete subjection and darkness, yet in the course of time the light began to break upon the minds of men, and to disclose the fact, in spite of the reigning ecclesiasticism, that this entire system of oppression was the offspring of usurpation and fraud. Then, like the possessors of all other ill-gotten power, the leading and most ambitious popes became adepts in all the arts and the practices of political intrigue and diplomacy, and in the pursuit of whatever means were necessary to maintain their authority, without any regard whatever to the morality or immorality of their acts. And thus it is that they themselves created the combination of influences out of which the Protestant Reformation arose. Had they been content to employ their spiritual power for the legitimate uses of the Church would have possessed within itself sufficient power to have applied the necessary corrective to all abuses in its government. But when they went beyond this and claimed the right to universal dominion as derived directly from God and as a part of the quote-unquote patrimony of Peter, it became necessary to the world that this claim should not only be resisted, but if possible, absolutely destroyed. It could not undergo any abatement merely, for according to the papal theory, the power of the papacy is plenary and can be nothing less, and therefore the contest, insofar as the papacy was concerned, was a death struggle. And thus we have seen that in point of fact, the Protestant Reformation in England, as the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth sufficiently demonstrate, was not so much a protestation against the faith and just authority of the Roman Church as against the abuses of the hierarchy and the gross corruptions practiced by them under papal sanction and toleration. There were many intelligent and devout Roman Catholics who before that time had been sagacious enough to understand and honest enough to declare that the papacy had departed from the apostolic teachings and the practices of the first centuries of Christianity. Their efforts preceding the great Protestant Reformation to save their ancient and time-honored church were heroic but unavailing. They are brilliant lights in these former centuries and attract no less our admiration than our wonder. They convince us, if anything were necessary to do so, that there was yet enough in the true faith of the Roman Catholic Church, even in the worst days of Rome, to give consolation to the Christian mind and to excite its liveliest Christian hopes, and that much that is essentially true and consistent with the teachings of the Savior and his apostles has been preserved in its shifting creeds during all the years of its existence. The genuine love and veneration they felt for the church to which their affections clung so tenaciously stimulated them to desire and to labor for its reform, for the lopping off of the decayed branches, that the trunk of the old tree, which had withstood so many storms, might continue to bear good and wholesome fruit. We cannot withhold from Anselm and Abelard and Arnold of Brescia, all devout Roman Catholics, the concession of sincerity for their bold appeals to reason against the unjust assumptions and usurpations of authority by the popes. They were not of the number of those commonly classed with the reformers, but when they asserted the right of free inquiry and free thought, they brought themselves under the ban of the papacy, which feared an open exposure of its enormous offenses against religion and society. And the controversy thus inaugurated necessarily incited such inquiries as could never therefore be suppressed or silenced. Nor can we fail to appreciate the integrity and manliness of Savonarola when he stirred up the people of Florence to intense excitement by his denunciation of papal infallibility, declaring that the constitutions issued by some popes had been annulled by others, that the opinions of some are contrary to those of others, and that the prevalent doctrines of the papacy led to, quote, evil doings, to waste in eating and drinking, to avarice, to concubinage, to the sale of benefices, and to many lies, and to all wickedness, unquote. It should increase our admiration of this intrepid priest to know what for the avowal of his honest convictions he lost his life. Arrested by violence, tried by authority of Pope Alexander VI with true inquisitorial mercilessness, and put to death by his persecutors, his courage, exhibited in the midst of the flames, imparted itself to his defenders and gave fresh impulse to the work of reform. If the reforms sought for by these and other faithful Christians had been obtained within the Church, the Christian world would have been disinclined to rebel against the spiritual authority of the popes, being content to regard it as indicating the unity of the faith. But the authorities of the Church, including popes, prelates, and inferior clergy, had become so corrupt that practical reform became impossible. The long residence of the popes at Avignon in France, brought about by the political intrigues carried on between the popes and princes, so demoralized those who conducted the affairs of the Church, both there and at Rome, that with them religion became a matter of secondary importance, if not of utter indifference. The Church was divided into parties and factions, each accusing and anathematizing the others as heretics and as schismatics, and visiting upon them the curse of excommunication. We have heretofore seen that Boniface IX was pope at Rome, while Clement VII and Benedict XIII respectively claimed the pontificate at Avignon in France. This state of things manifestly grew out of the quarrel between Philip of France and Boniface VIII, which was conducted with great asperity on both sides and reduced the election of a pope to a mere matter of temporal expediency, the real interests of the Church or of religion having little or nothing to do with it. The celebrated bull of Boniface, entitled Unum Sanctum, wherein he asserted that the Pope holds in his hands both the spiritual and temporal sword, led him into such direct conflict with the temporal power that without resistance on the part of the nations, he would have reduced them all to the condition of entire dependency upon the papacy. Hence we find Clement V securing the pontificate as the successor of Boniface VIII by taking an oath to Philip, quote, by the body of Jesus Christ, that he would, quote, blot out the memory of Pope Boniface VIII, unquote, and proceeding soon after his election to revoke several of the bulls of Boniface, and especially to declare, quote, that the bull unum sanctum should do no prejudice to the king or kingdom of France, and that all things should remain in the same posture they were in before that bull, unquote. Notwithstanding which, the faithful are now instructed that this same bull continues to be, even at the present day, a part of the Roman Catholic canon law. Hence, also, we find that after the death of Clement V, the discord prevailing among the cardinals occasioned so much delay in the election of his successor that the people became so disgusted as to set fire on the conclave and disperse the cardinals. The terrified prelates could not be assembled again until after the death of Philip, and the so-called chair of St. Peter remained without an occupant for 2 whole years. John the 22nd was then elected at Lyons and took up his residence at Avignon, and Nicholas V was elected at Rome. But the Italians, though backed by the King of Bavaria, were unable to protect their pope, and he ultimately fell into the hands of Pope John the 22nd, who imprisoned him until he died. So prostituted had the papacy become under such influences that heresy consisted in disobedience to the Pope in the merest trifles, and punishments were inflicted on account of them without the slightest remorse. John the 22nd caused 4 Grey friars to be arrested because they would not wear their gowns in the shape prescribed by his pontifical bull, Quarundam. They were condemned to be burned as heretics and were executed. A 5th one was degraded and imprisoned for life for the same offense. Benedict XII, the successor of John the 22nd, was himself a heretic in this, that he maintained that, quote, the souls of those who die in mortal sin descend actually right into hell, where they suffer the pains of the damned, unquote, which is an express violation of the doctrine of purgatory, which the General Council of Florence, at its 25th session in 1438, declared to have always been the doctrine of the Church. Such a condition of affairs as thus existed at Avignon, aided by what occurred during the subsequent pontificates of Clement VI, Innocent VI, Urban V, Gregory XI, and Urban VI, surrounded the papacy in the 14th century with an amount of corruption which had no parallel in all the previous history of the world. The good men of the Church, of whom there were many, were made heartsick at the spectacle. They desired reform, but were overpowered by the prevailing corruption. The 15th century opened with demands for 3 councils, one summoned by Pope Gregory XII, another by a rival pope, Benedict XIII, and the third by the cardinals. The latter, which assembled at Pisa, was the most numerously attended, having, besides a number of cardinals, ambassadors from France and England. That this council did not believe in the doctrine of papal infallibility is perfectly certain, for soon after it convened, it caused both popes, Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, to be called at the gate of the church, and neither of them appearing, proctors were appointed in the name of the universal church to consider what steps were necessary to be taken against both of them in order to put an end to the schism and restore the peace of the church. After they had been several times called and had failed to appear by themselves or through legates, the council unanimously adopted a sentence against them to the effect that they were both, quote, contumacious of faith and of schism, unquote. Here was an issue directly and explicitly made between the cardinals and these 2 contumacious popes, as to where the controlling authority of the church was lodged, whether in a general council representing the whole church, or as Pope Pius IX and his Jesuit defenders now say, in the Pope alone, as the infallible vicegerent of God. The settlement of this great question by the Council of Pisa assures us that if Pope Pius IX had been Pope, he would not have been considered infallible. Or if the Cardinals of Pisa had been at the late Lateran Council at Rome, the decree of infallibility would not have been enacted. It was decided that the Cardinals had power to call the council, that it was lawfully assembled, and that it had power to proceed to a definitive sentence against both popes. The trial was, therefore, entered upon with all necessary solemnity. The popes remained contumacious, although duly summoned to appear. Commissioners were appointed to appear for and to defend them. After all the evidence had been heard and duly considered, the council decided by a solemn and deliberate vote that both Gregory XII and Benedict XIII had violated their oaths by continuing the schism, and that all Christians were released from the obligation of obedience to them. Did you get that? The council bound all Christians not to obey these popes. Turnabout's fair play, isn't it? I mean, isn't this the power that the popes have always used to sustain their temporal and spiritual authority? To relieve the citizens of any nation that they choose simply not to obey the king? And here we have a council set about for the very purpose of settling this controversy between several popes, all claiming the chair of Peter, all at the same time, all claiming to be infallible and elected by the Holy Spirit of God and placed upon the throne of Peter as the successor of the rock and foundation of the church, has now condemned the popes and relieved anyone from obedience to them. Benedict XIII was accused of heresy upon the authority of the universities of Paris, Angers, Orleans, and Toulouse, and 300 doctors of that of Bologna. And all the accusations against him and Gregory XII being fully sustained, a decree was unanimously passed declaring that they were both, quote, manifest schismatics, favorers of schism, heretics, guilty of perjury and of the violation of their oaths, that they give a scandal to the whole church by their manifest obstinacies and contumacy, that they are unworthy of all honor and dignity, and particularly of the pontifical, and that they are fallen from it, deprived from it, and separated from the church ipso facto, unquote. The See of Rome was declared vacant. All Christians were forbidden to obey either of the popes, and all their judgments and sentences were declared null and void. Now, when it is considered that this council was composed of 140 cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and mitred abbots, of 26 doctors of divinity, of 300 doctors of civil and canon law, and of ambassadors from France, England, Jerusalem, Sicily, Cyprus, Poland, Brabant, Austria, Bavaria, and from a number of lesser powers.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Okay, welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update. My apologies to my listeners. I have lost feed from the station, and I'm not well apprised as when the break comes up and when the end of the program is. So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll try to get along here with things the way they are until correction can be made. I gathered that I may have run into the break a little bit with my discussion, so I'll back up a little bit for continuity. It says Benedict XIII was accused of heresy upon the authority of the universities of Paris, Angers, Orleans, and Toulouse, and 300 doctors of that of Bologna, and all the accusations against him and Gregory XII being fully sustained, a decree was unanimously passed declaring that they were both manifest schismatics, favorers of schism, heretics, guilty of perjury and of the violation of their oaths, that they give a scandal to the whole church by their manifest obstinateness and contumacy, that they are unworthy of all honor and dignity, and particularly of the pontifical, and that they are fallen from it, deprived from it, and separated from the church ipso facto, unquote. The See of Rome was declared vacant. All Christians were forbidden to obey either of the popes, and all their judgments and sentences were declared null and void. Now, when it is considered that this council was composed of 140 cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and mitred abbots, of 26 doctors of divinity, of 300 doctors of civil and canon law, and of ambassadors from France, England, Jerusalem, Sicily, Cyprus, Poland, Brabant, Austria, and Bavaria, and from a number of lesser powers, including some of the princes of Italy, it must require more than a common amount of assurance to pretend, as all Jesuit and ultramontane writers now do, that infallibility was always and everywhere the universal doctrine of the Church. For although it has suited the purposes of the papacy to deny that the Council of Pisa was an ecumenical council, and to disguise its proceedings as much as possible, yet that it did represent the real sentiments of the Church is abundantly attested to by the history of those times. There could not have been assembled in Europe any considerable concourse of Christians who would not have denounced the infallibility of the Pope as impious and unchristian. And of this we shall soon see more satisfactory proof than that furnished by the Council of Pisa. After Gregory XII and Benedict XIII had both been deposed, the Council of Pisa proceeded to the election of a new pope, when Alexander V was chosen, and being present, presided over the council and approved all its sentences and decrees. After a few more sessions, the council adjourned, and another general council was ordered to meet in 1412 to provide for the reform of the Roman Catholic Church. Pope Alexander V afterward published a bull in 1410 confirming all that the Council of Pisa had done, against which bull many ultramontane maledictions have since been hurled. In the meantime, Gregory XII assembled his council in Aquileia, but it was attended by very few prelates. He, however, caused it to decree that his election was canonical, as had been also that of Urban VI, Boniface IX, and Innocent X, and that the elections of Clement VII, Benedict XIII, and Alexander V, quote, were temerarious, unlawful, and sacrilegious, and that they were schismatics and usurpers, unquote. He, moreover, caused it to be announced that he would resign the pontifical dignity in order to restore harmony if Benedict XIII and Alexander V would also do so. For it must be remembered that there were now 3 popes, each claiming to be the successor of Peter. 3 infallible popes, all fighting over the pontifical chair and hurling anathemas at one another, calling one another Antichrist. And I always say with tongue in cheek, and they were all absolutely correct. Now, but Alexander V was disposed neither to surrender his dignity nor to carry on the work of reform which was expected of him by the Council of Pisa. He was under the control of Balthazar Costa, who directed the measures of his pontificate with the sole view of making himself his successor, in which he succeeded. Yet he was, says Dupin, the historian, quote, acknowledged for pope by all Christendom except Apulia and some part of Italy, which had not yet abandoned Pope Gregory, and the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Scotland, and the states of Count Armagnac, who acknowledged Pope Benedict, unquote. At his death, which occurred in 1410, Balthazar Costa was elected his successor and took the name John the 23rd. Now this John the 23rd was something else. As a matter of fact, some people who are familiar with the line of the popes will say, now wait a minute, there was a John the 23rd at the convention of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. But you're claiming now during this period of time there was a Pope John the 23rd? Yes, there was a Pope John the 23rd, and he was such an embarrassment to the Roman Catholic Church. So renounced by the Roman Catholic Church, such an embarrassment that Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s took the name to literally obscure the fact that there ever was a previous John the 23rd. That's how corrupt this Pope was, that the Roman Catholic Church has gone to the point of lying and duplicating a papal name to deny the very existence of this pre-existing Pope John the 23rd, Balthazar Costa. Now, at his death, which occurred in 1410, Balthazar Costa was elected his successor and took the name John the 23rd. He made war upon the King of Naples with a view of wresting his dominions from him and placing the Duke of Anjou upon his throne. The king, however, finally drove him from Rome, where he was hated by the people in consequence of having, quote, drawn great sums of money from the richest men in the city, unquote. He took refuge at the court of the King of Hungary, where he went to consult about the meeting of a council. He sent his legate to France with a bull, whereby he assured the French clergy that he desired that a council should be held at the time agreed on at Pisa, to endeavor to bring about a union between the Greek and Latin churches, to make peace between France and England, and, quote, to reform the church, both in its head and in its members, unquote. He finally succeeded by obtaining the protection of Sigismund of Hungary in getting his views so generally acquiesced in that he at last called the Council of Constance to meet in 1414, the time fixed at Pisa. This council, although thus convened by a pope who had participated in the proceedings of the Council of Pisa, and had, by acquiescing in them, committed himself to the doctrine that the council can try, condemn, and depose a pope, and therefore that popes are not infallible, is regarded by all the Church as the 16th Ecumenical Council. Whatever it did, therefore, carries with it the highest sanction of the Church, and has all the authority of law, canon law. Now, at this council, the means of restoring peace to the Church by terminating the schism were much discussed by the Fathers. Deputies attended from Pope Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, the former of whom proposed his resignation. The Fathers, however, although they declared that the Council of Pisa was lawfully celebrated, were mostly of the opinion that the best way to put an end to the schism was to require that all three of the popes, Gregory XII, Benedict XIII, and John the 23rd, should resign. They held that, notwithstanding John the 23rd was a lawful pope, yet the universal church might constrain him to resign, and that the council was the representative of the universal church. John endeavored to defeat this measure by sowing division among the members of the council, but all his exertions in that direction were without avail, the vote being unanimous. In the meantime, an Italian bishop accused John the 23rd of having committed, quote, all sorts of crimes, unquote, which were not immediately made public. The prelates from Germany, England, and Poland thought they ought not to be published because it, quote, could only serve to disgrace the Holy See, to scandalize the church and throw it in confusion, unquote. John at first thought he would defy the council and deny their power to depose him except for heresy, but he was persuaded by his friends not to make this attempt. Before the investigation of the charges was begun, the council proposed to him his resignation, according to the plan that they had previously adopted. Embarrassed as he was, he had no other method left which seemed to open the door of escape, and he accepted the plan without apparent pleasure, proposing that he would voluntarily resign if Gregory XII and Benedict XIII would also agree to do so. This contingent proposition was not acceptable to the council, and he made another equally unsatisfactory for the same reasons. A third one was drawn up, which, fear of the Emperor Sigismund, he agreed to accept. He then pronounced the declaration, and the next day repeated it in the presence of the council. He vowed and swore to God, to the Church, and to the Holy Council that he would resign so soon as Gregory XII, Benedict XIII should do so, or should be deprived of their claims of the pontificate by death or otherwise. He offered to visit Pope Benedict XIII himself and procure his abdication, but the council would not consent to this, suspecting that his only object was to get away from Constance and thus break up its sessions. This suspicion was not without foundation, for soon thereafter, notwithstanding he had promised the emperor that he would not leave, he escaped in disguise and took shelter in a castle several leagues distant, followed by only 5 or 6 cardinals, 4 of whom returned in a few days. This absence of the Pope led immediately to the consideration in the council of the question whether the Pope was above the council and therefore infallible, or was inferior to it and consequently not infallible. There were only 6 cardinals who maintained the first of these propositions and who insisted that the council was dissolved in consequence of the absence of the Pope. But the council answered them, quote, that the Pope was not above the council, but inferior to it, unquote, thus directly and emphatically condemning the doctrine of papal infallibility. Hang on a second. Now, surely my listeners are beginning to comprehend that by now God is intentionally making a mockery of this so-called infallibility of the popes. Through his influence, this charade is exposing for all the world to see, even a blind man, even someone of the basest intellect can comprehend that infallibility, papal infallibility, is straight from the pit of hell. Okay, there should be no question about this in history, in the present age. In the present age of affluence and the ability to think somewhat, God is literally making a mockery of the papacy, stripping from anyone any excuse to continue to believe in this propped-up, man-made abomination called the papacy. I see the hand of Almighty God in this, and I think men, all men, whether they be Roman Catholic or otherwise, should seriously consider that God's hand was in all of this to expose the papacy as the gigantic cosmic fraud that it is, and walk away. But that's not to be, is it? The world is going to continue in error until Christ himself comes and explains the whole mess. God hasten the day. It says the ill-fated John the 23rd, finding his effort to break up the council ineffectual, fled to another castle, where he summoned a notary and made solemn protestation against all that he had promised to the council, and swore to, because, as he said, he was, quote, forced to it by violence and fear, unquote. So little did the popes in those days regard even their most solemn oaths, though taken in the presence of an ecumenical council. I mean, these popes are resorting to the most childish behavior, because that's how God considers them. Childish, amateurish frauds, laughable on its face. And that's how they're going to be judged. That's how history judges them, and surely the judge of all heaven and earth will do so likewise. Now it says the council, in order to counteract the influences which John the 23rd was trying to invoke in his own behalf, then proceeded to pass several important decrees. In one of these, it is declared that the Council of Constance was, quote, lawfully assembled in the name of the Holy Ghost, unquote, that it, quote, represented the whole Catholic Church militant, had its power immediately from Jesus Christ, and that every person of whatsoever state or dignity, even the Pope himself, is obliged to obey it in what concerns the faith, the extirpation of schism, and the general reformation of the Church in its members and in its head, unquote. Other decrees were passed declaring that those who refused to obey the council, quote, even the popes themselves not accepted, excepted, unquote, should be punished. That if the Pope, when required by the council to renounce the pontificate, failed or delayed to do so, he had thereby forfeited his dignity, and no obedience was due him, and that if John the 23rd did not return to Constance, quote, they would proceed against him as a favorer of schism and suspected of heresy, unquote. Now, if they had charged him with heresy, they'd have been bound by their own Roman Catholic canon law to annihilate him by burning him at the stake, as they did all heretics. Can you imagine the Roman Catholic Church, a council of the Roman Catholic Church, burning one of their own popes at the stake for heresy? Maybe that would have been just too revelatory to the world as to the scandal that is the papacy. Now, John the 23rd resorted to many subterfuges to escape his impending doom. He endeavored to apologize for his secret departure from Constance by pretending that it was necessary on the account of the condition of his health, and even went so far as to propose the second time to resign. But the council had no confidence in him or his promises. Having already committed perjury by the violation of a most solemn oath, the fathers could put no other estimate upon him than that he was capable of any kind of treachery, was both base and false-hearted. They therefore proceeded with his trial, and after the most careful examination of the evidence and full deliberation, found him guilty of crimes before which the iniquities of the basest of modern criminals dwarf into insignificance. Dupin thus enumerates them, quote, now I'm going to tell the listeners before I even read this, that there is much written about the crimes of this particular pope that never surfaced because they were beyond decency. They were beyond scandal. And I'll just leave it go at that. But here's what is officially written about him. Lewdness and disorder in his youth, the purchasing of benefices by simony, his advancement to the dignity of a cardinal by the same means, his tyranny while he was legate at Bologna. Here's a clue. His incests and adulteries while he was in that city, his poisoning of Alexander V and his own physician, his contempt of the divine offices after he was pope, his neglecting to recite the canonical prayers and to practice the fast abstinences and ceremonies of the church, his denying justice and oppressing the poor, his selling benefices and ecclesiastical dignities to those who bid most, his authorizing an infinite number of dreadful abuses and distributing of preferments, and committing 1,000 and 1,000 cheats. His selling his selling of bulls, indulgences, dispensations, and other spiritual graces, his wasting the patrimony of the Church of Rome and mortgaging that of other churches, his maladministration of the spiritual and temporal affairs of the church, and lastly, his breaking the oath and promise he had made to renounce the pontificate by retiring shamefully from Constance to maintain and continue the schism. Unquote. Of Cormenin, another historian, gives the decision of the council somewhat more in detail. Thus, he says, quote, "The General Council of Constance, after having invoked the name of Christ and examined the accusations brought against John the 23rd and established on irrefragable proof, pronounces, decrees, and declares that Balthazar Costa, the Pope, is the oppressor of the poor, the persecutor of the just, the support of knaves, the idol of simoniacs, the slave of the flesh, a sink of vices, a man destitute of every virtue, a mirror of infamy, and devil incarnate. As such, it deposes him from the pontificate, prohibiting all Christians from obeying him and calling him Pope. The Council further reserves to itself the punishment of his crimes in accordance with the laws of the secular justice and his pursuit as an obstinate and hardened, noxious, and incorrigible sinner whose conduct is abominable and morals infamous, as a simoniac, ravisher, incendiary, disturber of the peace and unity of the Church, as a traitor, murderer, sodomite, poisoner, committer of incest, and corrupter of young nuns and monks," unquote. Few men have reached so low a point of infamy and degradation as that reached by John the 23rd, who is recognized by all the church historians as having been lawfully elected Pope. And on account of the enormity of his crimes, he was deposed and disgraced by the council, and all persons were forbidden to recognize him thereafter as Pope or to obey him. And Rome is so ashamed of the reputation of this Pope that they renamed a Pope John the 23rd in 1960 to cover up his very existence. The Pope's infallible? Give me a break. I'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.